Yeah, so I'm Courtney and I own Splat Hot Sauce. I started it about 5 years ago from Evergreen business program. And so I'll give you a little background on how I ended up there. So I'm from Jersey and I grew up with a mom who loved cooking, and I inevitably ended up in the kitchen. And this is like third grade, and I would overdose everything with cayenne. So they revoked my right pretty much in the kitchen in the entirety after pretty much ruining many meals to them, not to me. So I always had an affinity for spice. And then by the age of 20, I got really into like health and food and agriculture and sustainability. So I decided I wanted to be inundated with all of that. And I embarked on a journey to the West Coast. And I lived in California for a couple years, working in like local and organic delis and grocery stores, furthering my passion for like being around farmers and agriculture and just what it means to have a relationship with food. And then amidst that, I decided I love California and it was beautiful, but it wasn't my end point. And so I followed my partner up to Washington, where everything kind of really started to blossom. I That's actually in a pun, but I didn't realize it was pun till just now. But I ended up on this piece of land where we could pretty much do whatever we wanted. So I started this permaculture garden, and then also got a job in a brewery, learning a lot about fermentation through that and like a scientific way, and then having this garden with like an abundance of food and accidentally fermenting. And so it was a cool way to see like this parallel of uh not in retrospect, I realized like the controlled versus the accidental experimental sense of fermenting. And then I decided I wanted to do my own thing. So I went to Evergreen and studied business and learned a lot about sustainability in business and what that means, not just um, like, I studied B corporations, so I learned about DEI and I learned about leadership and like caring about your people. And Evergreen had this, I don't know if they still do it, but like it was the last quarter where you simulated starting a business, whether you wanted it to be real or not. And so I decided to do fermented hot sauce initially as for fun. And then I kind of realized like, oh, this is a very fitting thing for me. Like I love spice and I love being creative and working with farmers. And so I kind of took this and ran with it. Um, and then, yeah, I kind of through the fermentation and sustainability just kind of created this paradigm that I was really proud of. And now it's 5 years later and things shift. And so I've learned a lot about also what fermentation and sustainability means to me. Um, and it was a cool little journey. And so after deciding I wanted to go back to school and start this business, I was really excited about just going like gung ho. Like I want this to be successful. I want it to sustain me both financially, emotionally, all of that. And so I ended up giving it literally everything I had, time, energy. But then after 3 years of doing that and like sacrificing so much of my social life and so much of like my life just to this business, I realized sustainability is more than just um, caring about people on the planet. Like you also have to apply that to yourself. And so when Paige asked me, like, okay, you want to do a lecture on sustainability? I was like, I have just the thing because not enough people talk about sustainability for who you are and what you want your life to look like. And so, yeah, I think so that's kind of like my main focus today is how to build sustainability for a work-life balance in business, and how fermentation kind of can teach you ways to do that. And yeah, so now Splat is like I'll talk a little bit about how we're sustainable. So It's a fermented hot sauce business, which is a great way to basically have no waste. So we take peppers, we source everything from 100-mile radius. It's all organic and local, and we have a strong rapport with our farmers. So we take the ingredients, and virtually everything is in stainless steel tanks. There's very minimal plastic. And if there is waste, we upcycle it. So like we ferment, and then we have all these seeds and skins which get dehydrated and then turn into fermented pepper flakes, which is super fun. And it also something fermentation teaches you is like how to be innovative because there's so much creativity that lies within that. And then another principle that I have is like keeping things as close to the community as possible. So like all the artwork is done by local artists, and even the glass bottles are from Seattle, or at least purchased from them. And yeah, just trying to keep things in a very small radius. So it's like this grassroots approach to sustainability. And I work with a lot of women farmers, which is awesome. And yeah, and the bottles themselves are they're $10, so it's supposed to help have like, it's not just a hot sauce, it's also a health food, being that it's fermented, it's probiotic, and it's $10, so it's pretty accessible. And yeah, working with local artists and farmers and doing collabs, which is like a fun little side projects, because so it's kind of a play on words, collabs, and then LAB meaning lactic acid bacteria. And so I've worked with a lot of other businesses, and through that like have built wonderful, there's just a lot that you get when you support local businesses and local businesses support you, like it builds sustenance. And so I'm really very passionate about that. But like I said, yeah, for the first 3 years of Splat, like my idea was I'm going to go gung ho. It's going to catapult me and render success. And I really did think that. And so in retrospect, I realized like, no, that's the formula for burnout. And people in business don't talk about that enough. And so now 5 years later, I wish I had known that earlier. And I've learned a lot, and my idea of sustainability has shifted very much so. And so yeah, I also so now I've kind of like, you want to be sustainable for yourself, so you have a level head and you have homeostasis, because your your attitude and your energy is going to bleed into everything that you do in your business. And I basically got to the point where I couldn't have consistency. And so yeah, I've just derived a lot of philosophy from sustainability and fermentation. And the thing, so now I'm going to tell you why I love fermentation so much, and why it is like a life practice and not just about food and fun and weirdness. So I accidentally, like most people, kind of got into fermentation when I was about 20. I started making kombucha, and that, was not the most palatable. And then when I had my garden, I tried to make pickles, and they turned into sour pickles. And so I I realized, like, also working in the brewery, you can have like a controlled environment or extremely experimental and accidental environment. And they both render something edible, sometimes good, sometimes not so much. But it's fun to see like when you really understand something. So like in the brewery, it was like they understood it on such a microscopic level, whereas me, I understood basically something will happen eventually. And you they when you really love something, so like in the brewery world, they loved what they did, and I was just doing it for fun. And they kind of knew how to acquire the desired results, where me, it was just an experiment, and I was hoping for the best. But so like when you dive into something that you really love and you understand it more, you know, some things are going to be out of your control and there's variables that you have in your control. Um, and you could kind of learn to pull the levers to get what you want out of it. And so I've kind of learned in business, like, especially in business, there's always things popping up that you don't have control in, but you know that if you make this decision, it might give you this outcome. And so like with fermentation, it's the same thing. Like let's say you have, so there's time and there's 6 main variables in fermentation. One being time. And so time is going to affect the flavor. And so you can kind of manipulate that. And you can also, like, salt is going to affect the microbial content. And so you can kind of manipulate that. And the more you understand things, the more you can kind of manipulate it, which is, yeah, why in the beginning when I fermented, it was just for fun. But the more you, oh, thank you. Yeah, the more you dive into anything, I feel, and the more you understand it, the more you can not psych yourself out and not like get stressed out about it. You'll actually see like your decision making process gets way more clarified. Um, and so, well, so one of the books that I love, so back to the whole controlled versus uncontrolled philosophy, there's 2 fermenters that I follow. One is Sandor Katz. I don't know if anybody does fermentation or knows that name, but he does the art of fermentation, which is kind of dubbed the Bible. And then you have, and his whole philosophy is like, just try it out. It's an experiment. The worst that will happen is it fails, and then you learn and you move on. Whereas like David Zilbar, who spearheaded the fermentation program at Noma, which is the #1 restaurant in the world, he is like, everything's sterile there. Everything's extremely controlled. And it's interesting to see, you know, how both end up being fine. It's really more about your style. But Sandor Katz, so he has this book called also what is it, The Fermentation as Metaphor. And one thing that really stuck with me is every organism's food is a manifestation of its interaction with its environment. So like, to me, when you ferment, so when I first started Splat, I was buying all these peppers from a farmer. It was from the east, doesn't matter too much, but they didn't really care about like the soil. They just kind of cared about the abundance and the yield, and their quality wasn't that great, and the ferments were okay. And then I had to end up buying from other people, and I learned their farming practices were way more sustainable. So like they cared about the soil, and that inevitably made the ferment way more prolific and healthy. And so it just made me realize like everything from that story, from the root, from the soil to the pepper and the microbial content on the pepper is going to affect the outcome. And I've kind of learned, like in business too, every little thing that you do is habit forming, and it's going to eventually lead to some sort of outcome. So like if you give it something, if you're being mindful and you care about all the little things, it will eventually show and represent itself in a big way. Like there are times when I kind of would try to take shortcuts. That doesn't work because it will show. And so in fermentation, same thing. Like when you buy cheap, or you know, you don't really know the story behind the little pepper, like it will eventually show in the quality of the sauce. And yeah, so it's just kind of like a way to um have like just this little voice in the back of your head that says like, care enough now so later you'll be proud of it. Which in the beginning you don't know because you're still experimenting. And the other fun thing about fermentation that I've kind of derived is it's kind of, so there's 3 phases in fermentation. And they basically, like the first phase you have all this bacteria that's aerobic, and then it literally dies off to give life to this other bacteria that's anaerobic. And that happens a couple times. And I've kind of always deemed it as this like sacrificial love story where one bacteria is compromising itself for another to get to the ultimate goal, which is the lactic acid. And I was like, that's kind of a beautiful way to look at things when you really don't want to compromise something and you're kind of forced to get to the goal. And so every time, like, there have been times when um I'm like, oh, that goes a little bit against my value system, but I kind of am now forced to make that decision. But in this moment it sucks. In the long term, it's going to be for the better. And so fermentation kind of taught me that, like it's okay to let go of things to give life to something else. I know a lot of this is cheesy, but it's kind of what makes it beautiful. Fermentation is just like, it's such a primitive technology. Like we evolved with it and it's so much a part of us. It's literally like we ferment in our body and there's just so much that it teaches us. And so, yeah, I feel really fortunate to have that be a part of my business. And like even now, so I talked about burnout, and I ended up having to scale down to build more sustainability in my life. And so now I'm kind of working in restaurants more, and it's really cool to see how even restaurants have tied in fermentation as a means to be less wasteful. So like right now I'm working in a restaurant and they use the tops of things to ferment and turn into like some kind of sauce or some kind of pesto. And it's just a great way to utilize byproduct and make it something that's like so original. And like we've been doing this for thousands of years and now it's kind of been modernized. Um, yeah, so yeah, fermentation. I don't know if anybody ferments, but it's just a cool thing to incorporate in your life. Um, and so yeah, sustainability. So when I started Splat, I really thought it was going to be the thing that I was going to do for a while. And but there's so many things people don't tell you in the beginning, and you kind of like romanticize what it means to have a business. And how much it, like, you don't clock in and you don't clock out when you have your own business. It's around the clock, whether you want it to be or not. Like it, when you really, oh, hold on, you should switch the slide. Okay, yeah. So when you really care about something, um, you can't really shut your brain off from it. At least for me, it's like, is this going to do that? And even at night, you're thinking about it. But there is ways around it that I've learned, which is just the 80/20, which it's a golden percentage. It kept popping up in my life. So you can switch the slide. The Hara Hachi is this Japanese philosophy where you only eat until you're 80% full. And it's a mindful practice of eating, and you have to pace yourself because you don't know that you're full for at least 20 minutes. And when I learned this, I was like, oh, that can be applicable to so much stuff, because if you don't pace yourself, which is what I wasn't doing with Splat. Like I said, I was going gung ho, giving it everything I got. And I wasn't pacing myself, so I didn't realize how full I really was. But when you do that, like 80% is just like this perfect little number because you can't consistently give 100%. That's not sustainable. And so with this, yeah, you eat into your 80% full, and then now you're good for a while. And you could switch the slide again. So it shows up in that way. And the other thing I learned in business, there's this principle in business called the Pareto, Pareto. Um, and basically it's like 20% of what you do is going to affect 80% of the outcome. And this is like so pertinent when you're strategizing your business to avoid burnout. Because in my mind, when I first started, I'm just thinking I have to do everything. Like all the little things, if I don't do them now, it's gonna start slipping through the cracks. And also like I am the only owner in my business, which doesn't help any of this. Like I can't delegate, which just adds to the stress of it all. But had I known this, like would have saved me so much stress. Because the other thing in terms of running a business and strategizing is like you have to get really good at that. Like you can't, so you like you have your list of to-dos and don't chip away at the little things because even though that feels very like fulfilling in a way, and it feels great to like check off a chunk of that list, it's not going to have the best results. Like you want to, Mark Twain calls it swallow the frog, which is I don't know if anybody knows that saying, but it's a fun one. Basically, you have your to-do list and you make the thing that you know is the most important, but you want to do the least, the thing you do first. Otherwise, you know, you just kind of push it to the wayside. But because of that Pareto principle of like 20% of what you do is going to affect 80% of the outcome, that 20% really needs to be the thing, the big picture things. And most often than not, they're the most daunting, but swallow the freaking frog. Because if you don't, it really does start to accumulate and then make things more stressful. And so understanding what's mandatory is pertinent. And getting really good at like, this is kind of also where the fermentation philosophy comes in of like knowing how each variable is going to affect the ultimate outcome and which one is the most conducive to not having it be so stressful later and having it be positive and consistent. So yeah, the one thing though that I've also struggled with that I wish people tell you is, well, I think it's the caveat with the 80-20 is like when you're first starting, it's not necessarily the most feasible to only give 80% because it is like this is the impetus of it all and you have to kind of create this foundation. And so you have to like stabilize the foundation. So you might be giving it a little bit more than you want to initially. But I guess the thing I wish I knew in that moment is what do I want my life to look like? And so, and just if you are embarking on the entrepreneurial route, ask yourself like what do I want my life to look like? Like how many hours can I realistically give this? Because some people can work 60 and some people can be totally psychotic about their work-life balance, and that's fine for them if they have the energy. But if you are somebody that only wants to do like 30, 40 hours a week, make sure that that's incorporated in what you do. Otherwise, like I kind of use the philosophy of salt too. Like you can always add, but you can't really subtract salt. So like when you have a project that you're doing, like I'd rather start knowing that it's going to be 30 hours a week. And then if I want to pick up more, I can add to that. But it's way easier to pick things up than to start a project and then not be able to do it and try to stop it. Like that's, for one, that sucks. And for two, it's just really hard to take away from something that you cared about. And now all of a sudden you can't give it what you want. So I kind of use the salt um, philosophy for that. You can add, you cannot subtract, which is not what I did. I just kind of added all the salt. And then, so the 80-20, you can go to the next slide, the Ikigai. The other thing that I love Japanese philosophy, in case you haven't noticed, because I do think a lot of how they perceive things is very like logical and realistic. And so they have this philosophy on like when you choose something to do, so this one means it's a concept for a reason for being. And when you start a business, like it shouldn't just be about the money. It shouldn't just be about even just about your value system. It should be about something that's also realistic. And so I really love what they said here. They incorporated what you could be paid for. Because the other thing, when I started Splat, I thought eventually I'd make enough money where that would be my sole thing. And sure, if I really wanted it to be, I think eventually it could. But it's always really important to include these factors, like something that fulfills you and you're pursuing something you love. Because when you do that, I find when you love something, you really want to understand it. And the better you get at um, making it work in all the ways possible, because just like fermentation, sometimes you think you know the outcome, but there's all these other variables at play that you cannot control. But when you do understand something, you kind of learn to pull this lever over here and that lever over there. And maybe it's not exactly how you depicted it, but it's pretty dang close. And so when you have this ikigai, like this purpose, it just makes all the decisions that could have been stressful a little less stressful. And it sustains you. Like you really do have to be paid for what you do, because that's just the world we live in. Uh, and also when you're good at something, like you can see yourself thrive. And it's not just a means of like getting by. Like this, to me, ikigai is like the essence of finding something that is sustainable, especially in the business world. And it's not just thinking about like you, it's like, well, what does the world need? And so to me, like it's back to the whole sustainability thing. Like the world needs more sustainable grassroots businesses that care about the people around them and care about DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And uh, yeah, it's just an all-encompassing way to say like I'm really good at this. I know it can make me money, and also like I know the world needs this. And it's just, how do you not, like, to me that is gonna sustain naturally what you do. Like it's like, sure, you have there's so many ways to be sustainable, like economically, agriculturally, and socially and all that. But like when the root of it is actually like passion and love and care, like all those things will almost come inevitably, in my mind. Um, yeah, and sustainability for yourself too is like your life. Um, I just found that when I started Splat, I did have this, but the thing I wasn't realistic about was my work-life balance. And so when you guys do embark on that and you just, I wish, and even I talked to the chef yesterday, actually, when I was telling him about this lecture, like how you can care and you can get so stuck in caring and wanting to succeed that you forget about yourself, and getting to that point where you kind of start resenting. Like I started kind of resenting what I did because it was unrealistic. And so always, like, I wish somebody told me 5 years ago, like, you can't you can't possibly have this much weight on you and walk away and walk out of it feeling good and stable. Because like I don't know if anybody's ever been burnt out. I didn't know what that looked like. I'd always kind of been somebody that has a lot of momentum. So when I started to pick up even more, I thought I could handle it. But like the point of burnout, when you get to that, it's a really hard place it's not like there's no point of return, but like it is a hard place to come back from. And then in the business world, like, you know, when you have that momentum, you don't realize it right away. And so to be realistic with yourself initially is like, great, do that, because that's a great way to avoid burnout. And so, yeah, sustainability is a fabulous thing, but also apply it to yourself. And know what you need to sustain you. Like I know I needed a social life, but I compromised my social life for like 3 years. And so when I would show up to be social, I was so exhausted from my business that like I didn't even enjoy it. And these are all like little things that you just don't realize initially until you're in the moment, but they're avoidable. And nobody talks about in business. Like even when I went to school, and I love Evergreen was great for sustainability. Like, but yeah, nobody talks about, even so many people I talk to that do own a business are like agree with me. Like, why aren't more people talking about, like, when you own a business, there's so much weight and stress to it. You have to make time for yourself. And how do you do that though is like the real problem. So to have like that be a plan and a strategy, and make sure you do kind of have this clock in, clock out practice is very pertinent. I don't know, when Paige asked me to do this, the sustainability of like how, because right now, so Splat is doing well, but I had to scale way down and compromise like what I thought the trajectory was going to be for the next 5 years, because I didn't incorporate sustainability for myself. And so now it's like scaled down pretty significantly to find my homeostasis, where like if I had that initially, maybe the pacing that Haro Hachi bun me of like not maxing myself out and gavooning right away, like, and if I had a more pacing mindset, I wouldn't have to do like this dance of like going gung-ho and then dialing it back down, and then now maybe taking the baby steps to get to where I was, and being more mindful about each step along the way. Because burnout is real. Presenting your business that you never thought would happen is real. It happens way more than people realize, because behind closed doors, like businesses aren't always they're not what they appear to be. Like it's just hard, it's hard to be an owner. And so always sustainability for yourself, and finding the coping mechanisms to do so. Establish that in the beginning. Yeah, that's most of what I have to say. And trying to think if, the golden percentage is something like the 80-20. One of my bosses is like, oh, you're going to bring 100% today. And I was like, I'll give you 80. And then we started talking. He's like, he laughed. And then funny enough, that morning I had read this article on why giving 100%, it was just like this lovely little coincidence, but why giving 100% is kind of bullshit. Like you just can't. And also to have 100% and then have people expect 100%, and then the pressure of that is just like not feasible. And so I said that, and then we dove into this conversation. I was like, 80% is the perfect amount. Like I'm showing up, I'm doing the best that I can, and then some. Probably it leaves room to do more as well. Like I said, you can always add salt. And so 80-20 rule is like just the golden percentage for almost all of life. Like it just helps this stability start to form, and like I don't have to give 100%, because that's way too much. Like I still need room for my own mental capacity and to be mindful. Like when you give 100%, you're not as mindful as if you leave some wiggle room for like a little play and a little fun and like feeling good about what you're doing, and not burning yourself out. So yeah, my main point with all of this is like, don't get burned out. Fermentation is a really cool philosophy and practice. And I also encourage you all to go home and ferment something and like watch how it all derives and build some romance around it. And understand, like, to me, fermentation like has taught me the coping skills in business, because more often than not, like when you ferment, it's always usually okay. And so it's like, okay, so things might not have gone on the route that I wanted it to, but sometimes there's trade-offs, and right now it's like it's still okay, like everything's salvageable. So I kind of like tying those two together.
Thank you so much. If it's okay, Courtney, I'm going to open the floor for questions. Does that sound
Yeah, I
good?
love questions.
Awesome.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. A lot. But I think I realized I was really burnt out. Well, it had been 3 consecutive summers of not doing having any fun. And thinking that was a good thing because I was doing something I love. And then I got to this point where when I was being social, I wasn't myself. And I was like, oh no, that's kind of a red flag. And I kind of was just in this frequency of the sorts of like I can't calm down. Like I was just in a perpetual state of stress. And I was working out and doing things to try to remedy, but I just stopped feeling like myself. Like I wasn't being as playful. I was a little bit more serious, and I started to drift away from feeling rested, honestly. And So I noticed it then. What I
Thank you.
did to help that though was I just okay, yeah. So I decided I needed to let go a little bit of Splat. Like I scaled up to the degree where it was probably a 3-person job. Um, so unrealistic. And I just realized, for one, this isn't even what I want to be doing right now in my life. Like there's no room for me to learn more about food, which I wanted to be in the culinary world a little bit more. So I just decided uh, I have to let go of this to give life to that. Um, and so I let go of almost half of what I had scaled up to make room for. So now I work in Seattle in a kitchen, and I'm learning a lot of what I want to, and I'm doing a lot of what I want to be doing. Did it suck to like compromise what I thought my life was going to look like right now? For sure. But at the same notion, I'm like way more happy. I'm way more excited about life and what I'm pursuing. And I know that like it was a good decision because it's still centered around my ikigai. what I, yeah, just centered around like what eventually is my big goal. So it's just the way life rumbles sometimes, but it feels good to let go and learn that practice and be okay with it. So I think that was my way of dealing with burnout, is like, and trying to feel centered and calm, and like just knowing it's going to be okay, telling myself that enough. I guess. Um, some parts to be so fermentation as a philosophy, but using it as a way to be counterproductive. Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to the Pareto principle of like even with fermentation, there's things that you can do like to be over the top controlling. But you don't have to do that. Like, so like with your project, um, like I would say just what are the things that are, I'm trying to think, counterproductive. I think the little things that maybe don't matter as much and focusing on them is counterproductive, even though they're a part of the picture in a way. It's like that kind of comes into the whole strategizing and prioritizing and letting go. So it's like maybe let's say you give yourself 5 hours a day to work on your music, but that doesn't allot enough time to do all the small things. That's okay. Just let it go. Because then it's counterproductive. Like you said, now you're kind of burnt out and it's affecting and it's bleeding into the overall what you want to do. Well, okay, so you got to trim the fat a little bit. And prioritize like, well, what's the thing that's going to have the biggest effect? And so like with fermentation, I know that if I omit salt, that's going to not be good. Like that's the essence of giving it all life. So yeah, I think too, like finding the sweet spot of the things that you do enjoy. So like maybe you swallow the frog, but now you kind of like reward yourself with something that you like to do in your business that makes you feel good and is fun. Like you don't want to just the same notion of like trying to isolate the things that are most important to get done. You also don't want to just do that. Like you need to pepper in um things that are fun and enjoyable in your business too, to avoid the burnout and to not make it counterproductive. That makes sense. So like what I've started doing in my like to-do list is like, okay, here's the two big picture things. Make sure I check them off. Here's maybe like 5 of the things that aren't as mandatory, but I know I need to do. And then trying to at least make like 2 to 3 of those things fun. Um, which is like, so I do this like collab well, I was doing it more so. And to me, that's like, okay, cool. It marries exposure. It's cool to find things that help your business, but are also good for you. So like for me, it was collaborations. Like I get to work with other people. I get to promote Splat, but also like the collabs are super fun. Or like going to events. Those can be draining, but like I go and I get to talk to people and I get to, see my business in a new light, and experience different things. And so it's like, I guess also to touch onto this is like find things that are fun and productive and all that. So like with music, I don't know, maybe I'm sure you would know more. I don't know enough about that to give you advice on what to do, but look for stuff like that and make sure you also make it a priority. Be creative.
Mm.
All right, I'm gonna, there's some questions coming through the chat. They've been coming from participants, and I also have submitted some of the student questions that came before your session. First question, was it hard getting into locations around the area? I've seen your sauces all over Olympia.
Ooh, no, actually. And I think that's like also the beauty of having a business where sustainability is key because it's like a part of that is focusing on community. So like my ingredients are very community focused, and therefore the community is very who at least share similar values is very receptive to that. So like when I embarked on well, I should say I embarked during 2020, which was not the easiest time to try to sell something. But like the grocery stores, the co-ops, similar value systems. So like it was pretty easy to get into them. And they still continue to support me in all the right ways. So it's nice to have that relationship. So no, not that terribly hard. And it's a product too that I felt like it doesn't exist, so it's very nuanced. And that helped get into stores as well.
Next question. What is the biggest misconception about fermented goods?
Oh, yeah, people love to think that they're hazardous or can kill you or like be bad, botulism, all that stuff. It is one of the safest preservation methods. Um, and another misconception. Yeah, that's probably the biggest one. A lot of times people like, oh, it's unpasteurized, it's raw. Well, how does that last like over a year? I'm like, because it's so good at keeping itself alive. Whereas like the irony, like so canned goods have a way higher chance of having botulism than fermented goods. So that's a pretty big misconception. Oh, the other big misconception is people think it's really hard. And like if you start it and you fail, like most of the time when you make kraut, your first kraut's not going to be that great. And then you kind of get like uh defeated feeling. It is one of the easiest things to do. And just because it doesn't taste that great doesn't mean just keep going and trying. It is way easier. And don't get so scientific about it. Like, especially in the beginning, just have fun and experiment and don't take it too seriously. And if you do have something weird happen, it's probably fine still. I have a lot of people come to me at like farmers markets and be like, there was a white mold on top of my ferment. So I just threw it all away. Like what went wrong? And I was like, actually nothing. You could just scrape that off and it's totally fine. So the misconception is like, yeah, it's mostly going to be okay. Keeps going back to that, but it's true.
I'm
Um,
gonna ask another one that's kind of a follow-up to what you just were talking about. What's the easiest thing to ferment, and where would you direct someone to start?
okay, yeah. Well, you can virtually ferment anything, but I think kraut probably is a good place to start, mostly because it's the most ubiquitous ferment. So, like, if you wanted information on it, it's easy to find. It's relatively easy. Like, you just get your salts and a bowl, and you shave your kraut, and you sprinkle it, and you taste it as you go. You don't need anything really, like you don't even need a scale. And then the biggest thing with that is just making sure there's no air getting in. um so kraut would be a great first start, and if something does go awry, it's easy to find troubleshooting online. And it's a shorter ferment. I mean, most ferments you can do, some people say a week. I think you should go at least 3 for all the health benefits. But it's just an easy thing to monitor. um yeah, kraut, and also cabbage is cheap. So like if it fails, not a big deal. Um and fails, but it just might not taste that good. Uh and so for ingredients with that, I will say when you go to find cabbage to ferment, try to find fresh stuff, because if it's a little older, it'll be dry and then won't have enough liquid to submerge it. So try to find some fresh stuff. That's a whole conversation about how to ferment, um, which I can totally answer if you want to email me and stuff. But yeah, fresh stuff when it comes to fermenting is best. That's a good rule of thumb.
Awesome. Next question. Are your products available with the organic farm products here at Evergreen and their stand on campus?
No, I never thought to do that. It,
Well,
it does need to
let
be
us know if you need any connections, because we can.
okay. Yeah, the hard part for me is the refrigeration aspect. So,
All right, next one. What were some of your favorite discoveries you've made in your fermentation exploration?
ooh, oh, okay. Yeah, well, specifically with hot sauce, I've learned the anatomy of, which does kind of transpire into other things that you want to ferment, but the anatomy of the pepper has a huge effect on consistency, like the how liquid, how liquidy or how thick basically the sauce is going to be, and how I can manipulate that. So like the first year when I did splat, I had the same ratio of everything for all the sauces, but the green sauce kept coming out extremely thin, which I kind of hated. And so I learned because of the anatomy, like the walls on the membrane and the walls on the pepper basically didn't give it enough fluff to make it thicker. So what I ended up having to do was treat it a little different by like not adding as much brine and taking out more brine at the end. And so I kind of learned basically the anatomy for anything is going to have an effect on the consistency, and then I've learned how to manipulate that. The other cool thing I've learned is salt content. So like they say, the longer you ferment, the more salt you should add for safety reasons. But there's like a sweet spot, because if you add, as you ferment, it builds the umami flavor, which is salty in and of itself. So you don't want to add too much salt, because it's going to end up being saltier than you think it is if you go for a long period of time. So that was kind of a cool. So there's like a sweet spot when it comes to long ferments, because I ferment splat for about 8 months. So I have to be careful with the salt percentage.
All right, next question. Are there any fermented foods that would be good for people to consume frequently? Just curious, after listening to the food program podcast and Sandor speaking about how fermented foods helped his digestive system. I've never really thought about fermented foods deeply before and how it might impact my own health.
Oh yeah, I mean, honestly, almost any fermented food, kraut is a great way. I did hot sauce because I thought like, okay, here's this quintessential condiment. Most people have it, and then now I've tied into how to incorporate fermented foods in your diet pretty easily. But outside of hot sauce, kraut, if you like the flavor, that's usually the caveat, is like sometimes people don't like the flavor of fermentation because it can be a little funky. Wine. No, I'm just kidding. Uh, I'm trying to think of another good condiment that you find pretty easily. Well, kraut, because it's on the cheaper side of the ferments, it's really good for you. You can put it with almost any meal, toss it in a salad, put it on the side, scoop it right out of the jar. Holy kraut is great for that. So yeah, I'd say that. And then it's also, cabbage is really, not only is the fermentation aspect, but cabbage is really healthy for you. So that's a good way to incorporate it.
Awesome. Looks like we've got a hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I think the 80-20 rule kind of applies here again, but like if I was to go back and write more, like I had a business plan and I had my sales trajectory and all of this, but I didn't necessarily pace out my expansion. So I think that if I kind of maybe had a more calibrated way of phasing it, so like phase one, which is actually now, funny enough, I met this graphic designer and I'm rebranding a little bit, and he's so good. He's like, okay, we're gonna do 3 phases. And I'm like, genius. Where it's so much more efficient and productive, because I was trying to do most all of it at the same time, and like start it, stop it with one project, start it, stop it with another, versus like focusing on one phase and maybe like 3 to 5 objectives for that phase, getting it done, and then moving on to like phase 2, and having like more of a tiered system versus choppy. And so yeah, I think like yeah, like if like you want, to me, like, look, I rebranded twice now because I didn't do this whole phasing thing. Like I didn't have a clear necessary vision. But I think if you start with a clear vision you can map out like a phasing plan and strategize way more efficiently where you're not burning yourself out and where you're like the allotted time for this, you can map it out way better and have a better idea of what it's going to take, and therefore know how to pace it out versus just thinking it's going to work, which it kind of does, but maybe not to its best potential.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because phasing is like a big part of pacing and not getting burnout and doing things mindfully.
Once again, Courtney, I just want to give my gratitude to spending your time with us today. I think that this topic, you're right, is not one that's talked about a lot. It's almost never talked about in business education, as you said, but so necessary and essential. So thank you so much.